I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment.
You know that feeling, right? That pure, simple moment of peace after a long, hard night? For Sarah Jenkins, that moment was the sizzle of pancake batter on a warm griddle, the smell of vanilla and maple syrup filling her small kitchen in a quiet Cleveland suburb. The sunrise was painting her walls in streaks of gold and orange. She just finished a double shift at the hospital, her feet aching, her back sore. But none of that mattered. This was her ritual. This was for her son, Lucas. She was a nurse, a single mom. Her life was a carefully balanced tower of bills, night shifts, and a deep, ferocious love for her 11-year-old boy. Lucas was different. Quiet. He didn't have many friends. The other kids on the block sometimes called him names. It broke Sarah's heart. So, these pancake mornings were her armor. They were her way of building a fortress of normalcy around them, of proving that their little family of two was enough. She poured the batter into a perfect circle, humming a tune she didn't even know. She was thinking about Lucas, still asleep upstairs. She was thinking about the new graphic novel she'd bought him, waiting on the table as a surprise. She was thinking that maybe, just maybe, today would be a good day. And then, the knock. It wasn't the friendly rap of a neighbor. It wasn't the quick, sharp tap of the mailman. This was different. Firm. Authoritative. 3 heavy, deliberate beats against the front door that seemed to stop the very air in the house. Boom, boom, boom. Sarah's spatula froze mid-air. Her heart gave a single, hard thud against her ribs. Who could that be at 7:15 in the morning? Maybe Mrs. Gable from next door, needing help with something? But the knock didn't sound like Mrs. Gable. It sounded like trouble. She wiped her hands on her apron, a faint, greasy sense of dread already starting to pool in her stomach. She walked through the living room, the cheerful morning light now feeling suddenly exposed, intrusive. She pulled back the lace curtain on the door's window just an inch. And her world, that carefully balanced tower of pancakes and love and hope, began to crumble right there on her front porch. There were 2 of them. A man and a woman. They stood with a patient, grim stillness that only one profession has. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, had a badge clipped to his belt. The woman held a small, black notebook. Their faces weren't angry. They weren't in a hurry. They were just grave. Deeply, terrifyingly grave. Sarah's hand trembled as she turned the deadbolt. The click echoed in the silent hallway. She opened the door, the cool morning air hitting her face. The smell of pancakes suddenly seemed sickly sweet. "Sarah Jenkins?" the male detective asked, his voice low and even. "Yes. Can I help you?" Sarah heard the tremor in her own voice. The detective's eyes were kind, but they didn't smile. "I'm Detective Miller. This is Detective Vance. We're with the Cleveland Police Department. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Sarah's mind was a frantic, scrambling thing. Questions? About what? A parking ticket? A report from the hospital? It had to be a mistake. Then Detective Vance spoke, her voice softer, but her words were like ice. "It's about Tommy Wilkins, the little boy from down the street." Sarah's blood ran cold. Tommy. Lucas's only friend. Or he used to be. "And ma'am," Detective Miller said, his gaze shifting past her, into the heart of her home. "We need to speak to your son, Lucas." And in that moment, standing in her doorway with the smell of breakfast burning behind her, Sarah Jenkins knew, with a mother's terrifying instinct, that the peace she had fought so hard to build was gone forever. The fluorescent lights of the police interview room hummed like a trapped insect. It was a sterile, windowless box that smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. Sarah sat beside Lucas, her hand clamped over his smaller one on the cold table. He was so calm. He swung his legs back and forth, his sneakers barely scraping the linoleum floor. He looked like any other kid waiting in a boring office. But this wasn't a doctor's appointment. Detective Vance sat across from them, her voice carefully neutral. "Lucas, we're just trying to understand what happened to Tommy. Can you tell us about the last time you saw him?" Lucas just shrugged, his gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the wall. And as Sarah watched her son's utter lack of concern, a memory, sharp and unwelcome, stabbed into her mind. It was from about a year ago. She'd gone into his room to put away laundry and found a small, dead sparrow on his windowsill. It wasn't just lying there. It was arranged. Its wings were spread perfectly, its tiny head tilted at an exact angle. Next to it were a few pebbles and a twisted piece of wire. When she'd asked him about it, her voice shaky, Lucas had just blinked and said, "I found it. I was studying it. Its structure is efficient. No sadness. No disgust. Just clinical interest." Sarah, her heart pounding, had told herself he was just a curious boy, a budding scientist. She'd made him bury it, and she'd buried her own fear right along with it. Back in the interrogation room, Detective Miller leaned forward. "We found something interesting near where Tommy was discovered, Lucas. The bag was closed with a very specific kind of knot. A bowline." Sarah's breath hitched. The air left the room. Another memory, this one so recent it felt like a physical blow. Just a few months ago, Lucas had been obsessed. He'd spent days practicing knots with an old piece of rope, after a sailing camp he'd gone to for a week. He'd left little knotted creations all over the house. The one he was proudest of, the one he said was strong and reliable, was the bowline. In that sterile humming box of a room, the two detectives, the evidence, her son's empty face, it all started to click together with a terrifying final sound. The rationalization she'd built her world on, he's just shy, he's gifted, he's misunderstood, began to crack and splinter. She looked at Lucas, really looked at him. She searched his eyes for a flicker of fear, of confusion, of anything a normal child would feel in this nightmare. But all she saw was a placid, deep, and terrifying void. It was the same look he'd had when studying that dead bird. And in that moment, Sarah Jenkins wasn't just scared for her son. For the very first time, sitting right beside him, holding his hand, she was scared of him. If you think the worst part was the police station, you'd be wrong. The interrogation was a private hell. What came next was a public execution. Sarah and Lucas were released that first day, pending further investigation. But as they turned onto their street, Sarah's foot slipped off the gas pedal in pure shock. Their quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac was gone. In its place was a circus. 3 local news vans were parked at crooked angles, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like strange metal flowers. Reporters with perfectly coiffed hair and sharp shoulders huddled together, their voices a low, hungry murmur. And then, a spotlight. A camera light, blinding white, swung directly into Sarah's windshield. It felt like being caught in the act of a crime she didn't even know she'd committed. She shielded her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see the headlines already, painting her son as a monster before he'd even been charged. She somehow managed to steer the car into her driveway, the reporters closing in like a tidal wave. They didn't shout yet, they just filmed, their lenses like 100 unblinking eyes, capturing every second of her shame. She hustled Lucas inside, his small hand in hers, his head down. He seemed interested, curious about the commotion, not frightened by it. Once inside, she slammed the door deadbolted and leaned against it, her whole body trembling. She peeked through the blinds. The crowd was still there. That night, she saw it on the local news. There was her house, on television. And there, in the corner of the screen, was a graphic that made her stomach drop. It read, "Devil Child of Maple Grove." She clicked the TV off so hard the remote cracked. The next day, the silence from the neighborhood was louder than any news report. She had to go to the store for milk. As she walked down her own driveway, she saw Mrs. Gable, her sweet, elderly neighbor who always asked about Lucas's grades, quickly turn and go back inside, closing her door with a firm, final sound. Across the street, the Wilkins house was dark, their curtains drawn tight. A profound, aching shame washed over Sarah. She was a leper, and her son was the plague. But the deepest cut came from a place she never expected. A few days later, she checked the mail, a task that now felt like running a gauntlet. Amid the bills and junk mail was a small, plain, white envelope. No return address. Just her name, handwritten. For a foolish second, her heart leapt. A note of support? Maybe from a distant relative who'd seen the news? She tore it open, her hands shaking. Inside wasn't a letter. It was a mass-produced sympathy card. You know the kind, with a soft focus picture of flowers on the front. It was the card you send when someone dies. Confused, she opened it. There was no handwritten message, just the pre-printed words, "With deepest sympathy." But someone had taken a black pen and had scrawled 4 words over the gentle, generic poem. 4 words that would be burned into Sarah's soul forever. You raised a monster. She dropped the card like it had bitten her. It fluttered to the floor, the cheerful flowers face up, a cruel joke. This wasn't just the opinion of a faceless mob on TV anymore. This was targeted. This was intimate. This was someone who knew where she lived, someone who had looked at her son and seen what she had refused to see for so long. And in that moment, standing alone in her silent, besieged house, Sarah Jenkins started to believe they might be right. After the circus of the media and the cruelty of the neighbors, the sterile, quiet office of David Chen should have felt like a sanctuary. It wasn't. It felt like the antechamber to a war. Sarah sat across from him, her hands clenched in her lap. David Chen was the court-appointed attorney assigned to Lucas's case. He wasn't what she expected. He was young, with tired eyes that had seen too many cases like this, and a calm, deliberate way of speaking that didn't offer false hope. "Sarah," he began, leaning forward, his voice low and steady. "I need you to understand something right now. This isn't going to be about proving Lucas is innocent. The evidence, the fingerprints, the knot, it's substantial. Our fight is about one thing, and one thing only, his mind." He explained it in cold, hard terms. Because Lucas was only 11, they couldn't be tried as an adult. The goal wasn't to win an acquittal. The goal was to avoid a conviction that would lock him away in a maximum-security juvenile facility until he aged out at 21. Their only chance was to paint a picture of a deeply troubled child, one who needed treatment, not just punishment. "We're going to have him evaluated by a psychologist," David said, tapping a pen on his legal pad. "Dr. Eleanor Evans. She's the best. We need her to testify that Lucas doesn't understand the moral weight of his actions, that he's impaired." The word hung in the air. Impaired. Sarah flinched. It was a clinical, cold word for the terrifying void she had seen in her son's eyes. A few days later, they met Dr. Evans. She was a woman in her 50s with a kind, but unreadable face. She spent 2 hours with Lucas in a play therapy room, while Sarah paced the hallway outside, each minute feeling like an hour. When the door finally opened, Dr. Evans emerged. Her kind face was still, but her eyes were troubled. Deeply troubled. She didn't say much to Sarah, just a polite, "I'll be in touch with Mr. Chen with my full report." But the look on her face was a verdict in itself. That night, clinging to a shred of hope, Sarah tried to do what any mother would do. She sat Lucas down on the couch. "Lucas, honey," she began, her voice trembling. "When we go to court, when the judge and the jury look at you, they need to see that you're sorry. They need to see that you're sad. Can you show them that? Can you practice looking sad for me?" Lucas looked at her, his head tilted. Then he complied. His lower lip jutted out. His eyebrows drew together. He manufactured an expression of sorrow so perfect, so convincing, it broke Sarah's heart. For a single, glorious second, she thought, he understands. He can learn. And then, the moment she nodded in approval, he dropped the act. The mask vanished instantly, replaced by his usual placid blankness, as if a switch had been flipped. He hadn't felt sad. He had simply performed it. Perfectly. On command. Sarah stared at him, the last of her hope curdling in her chest. David Chen's strategy was their only chance. But in that moment, she realized the horrible truth. They weren't just defending a child who didn't understand right from wrong. They were defending a child who could mimic understanding so well, he might just fool everyone. And the one person he couldn't fool anymore was his own mother. The courtroom wasn't like the ones on TV. It was smaller, older. The wood was dark and scarred, the air thick with the smell of lemon polish and old fear. Sarah sat at the defense table, David Chen on one side, Lucas on the other. Lucas was swinging his legs again, his new dress shoes barely touching the floor. He had a yellow legal pad and a pencil. He was drawing. This was the first day of the real trial. The day the prosecution would lay out its case. And the prosecutor, a man named Mr. Albright, was a predator. He wasn't loud or dramatic. He was quiet, precise, and merciless. He stood before the jury, a group of 12 ordinary people from the Cleveland area, and he began to build a wall around an 11-year-old boy, one brick at a time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Albright began, his voice calm and reasonable. "This is not a complicated case. This is a case about choices. The conscious, deliberate choice of one child to end the life of another." He started with the timeline. He put up pictures of Tommy Wilkins on a screen, a happy, gap-toothed boy with red hair and freckles. He showed the jury a map of the neighborhood, tracing the route from Tommy's house to the park, and then to the storm drain where his small body was found. It was all so clinical, so clean. It made something monstrous sound like a simple math equation. Then came the first brick. The murder weapon. The bailiff carried in a clear evidence bag. Inside was a rock, about the size of a grapefruit. It was dark, with a rough, jagged edge. "This," Albright said, pausing for effect, "was found at the scene. It has the victim's blood and tissue on one side." He let that hang in the air for a moment. The jury stared, stone-faced. Then he continued. "And on the other side, clean and clear, we found a full, perfect set of fingerprints." He turned and looked directly at Lucas. "The fingerprints of the defendant, Lucas Jenkins." A soft murmur went through the courtroom. Sarah felt a physical pain in her chest, as if the rock had struck her instead. She glanced at Lucas. He was looking at the rock, his head tilted, as if it were a mildly interesting fossil in a museum. Brick by brick, Albright continued. He brought in the forensics expert who confirmed the fingerprints. He brought in the coroner who described Tommy's injuries, his voice a dry, medical drone that couldn't quite hide the horror of what he was describing. Sarah wanted to put her hands over her ears. She wanted to scream. She just sat there, frozen. Then, the knot. Albright held up another evidence bag. Inside was a length of blue nylon rope, tied in that distinct, loop-shaped knot, the bowline. "This was used to secure the bag the victim was placed in," Albright said. He then presented a photograph, blown up poster size, for the jury. It was a picture from Lucas's own bedroom, taken by the police during their search. On his desk, amidst his books and models, was a length of identical blue rope, with a bowline knot half-finished. The connection was visceral. You could see it on the jurors' faces. They weren't just hearing about evidence anymore. They were seeing the obsession, the practice, spilled from the defendant's own bedroom into a crime scene. But the most devastating blow came from the witness stand. A boy named Mark, from Lucas's class. He was nervous, fiddling with his collar, but he spoke clearly. "We were on the playground a few months ago," Mark said, avoiding looking at Lucas. "And Tommy was talking about maybe moving away." Lucas got quiet. Then he said, "Take your time, son," Albright encouraged gently. Mark took a shaky breath. He said, "It would be easy to make someone disappear. The woods are big. No one would ever find you." The air went out of the room. It was no longer about just physical evidence. It was about intent. A premeditated thought, spoken aloud. Throughout it all, Lucas kept drawing on his legal pad. He wasn't scribbling. He was creating intricate, detailed mazes, one line after another, walls within walls, with no clear beginning and no visible end. He was completely detached, a small island of calm in the storm of accusations and grief swirling around him. And as the prosecutor finished his opening arguments, the picture he painted for the jury was complete, and it was terrifying. A remorseless, calculating child who had not only committed an unspeakable act but had thought about it, planned for it, long before he ever did it. The puzzle was assembled, and every piece pointed to the small, quiet boy, diligently drawing his mazes, trapped in the center of it all. If the prosecution's case was like watching a wall being built around her son, then the defense's turn was like watching David Chen try to dismantle it with his bare hands. He did his best. He cross-examined the forensics expert, asking if the rock could have been picked up innocently. He questioned the boy, Mark, suggesting he might have misheard Lucas, that it was just kid talk. But the bricks were too heavy, the mortar too strong. The jury's faces were closed doors. And then David made a decision. A desperate one. He called his only character witness to the stand. He called Sarah. Hearing her own name echo in the courtroom was like a physical blow. Her legs felt like water as she walked the short, terrifying distance to the witness stand. The air felt thicker there. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down, her fingers gripping the cool, polished wood of the rail. She looked out and saw a sea of faces, the jury, the judge, Tommy's family, their eyes like hot coals burning into her. She looked at David Chen, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Then her eyes found Lucas. He had put his pencil down and was watching her. His expression one of mild, detached curiosity, like a scientist observing an experiment. David's questions were soft, leading. He had her talk about Lucas as a baby, as a toddler. She spoke about his quietness, his intelligence, his struggles to make friends. She talked about the bullying, her voice cracking with a mother's helpless pain. For a few beautiful minutes, she wasn't the mother of a monster. She was just a mom, fighting for her child. She started to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe they could see him. Really see him. And then, it was Mr. Albright's turn. The prosecutor stood slowly, a panther uncoiling. He didn't approach the stand immediately. He just looked at her, and his silence was more terrifying than any question. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, his voice deceptively calm. "You describe a sensitive boy, a victim. But is it true that you work the night shift, often leaving Lucas alone for hours?" I had to support us," Sarah stammered. "And the dead bird found in his room, arranged on the windowsill. You were aware of this?" "Why, yes, but he was just curious." "Curious," Albright repeated, letting the word hang. "And the knots. The specific bowline knot. You knew he was practicing those for weeks. After sailing camp, yes, but you never thought, as a mother, to connect these dots? A dead animal, an obsession with binding knots, a history of social isolation." His voice was still quiet, but each word was a needle. Sarah felt the walls closing in. I thought he was just a boy." Then, Albright did the unthinkable. He walked to his table and picked up a single piece of paper. He held it up for the jury to see, then turned back to Sarah. "Ms. Jenkins, I show you State's Exhibit 42. Do you recognize this?" She squinted. It was a receipt. From a grocery store. Her grocery store. Dated the day before Tommy Wilkins disappeared. It's my receipt," she said, confused. "Can you read the third item down, please?" Albright's voice was icy. Sarah's eyes scanned the list. Bread, milk, eggs, and then she saw it. The item was highlighted in bright yellow. Her blood turned to ice. "Heavy-duty contractor bags," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Heavy-duty contractor bags," Albright boomed, now addressing the jury. "The exact same brand, the exact same make, as the bag Tommy Wilkins's body was found in." He turned back to her, his eyes sharp. "You bought the murder weapon, Ms. Jenkins. The day before the murder. Did you give that bag to your son?" The world shattered. "No, I bought them for yard waste. I forgot they were even in the house. But it was too late. The narrative was sealed." The picture Albright painted was no longer just of a neglectful mother, but an unwitting accomplice. She had provided the tools. She had ignored the signs. She had, in the eyes of everyone in that room, built the monster with her own blindness. She broke. The tears came, hot and shameful, sobs racking her body. She looked over at Lucas, through her blurry vision, desperate for anything. And he was still just watching, studying her breakdown with the same calm, analytical interest he'd given the dead bird. In that moment, on the witness stand, completely unraveled for the world to see, Sarah Jenkins finally understood the true cost of her love. It was the total and complete destruction of herself. After Sarah's breakdown on the stand, the courtroom felt different. It was no longer just about a dead boy and an accused one. It was about a broken mother, and the why behind it all. The air was thick with a new kind of anticipation when David Chen stood and said, "The defense calls Dr. Eleanor Evans to the stand." Dr. Evans walked in, a calm, composed figure in a simple suit. She didn't look at the jury with pleading eyes. She looked at them as if they were students in a lecture hall, about to receive a difficult lesson. She was a forensic psychologist, and she had spent over 20 hours with Lucas, conducting tests, interviews, and evaluations. David started gently. "Dr. Evans, can you tell the court about your qualifications?" She listed them, her degrees, her publications, her specialty in juvenile behavioral disorders. Her voice was calm, authoritative. She was someone you had to believe. Then David asked the question everyone was waiting for. "Based on your extensive evaluation, what is your professional diagnosis of Lucas Jenkins?" Dr. Evans took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping across the jury. "Lucas presents with a severe and rare form of conduct disorder, with what we call callous and unemotional traits. This is not simple delinquency. It is a profound neurological and developmental condition." She began to unpack it, piece by piece, in language so clear it was terrifying. She explained that Lucas's brain is fundamentally different. She described tests she'd performed, showing him pictures of people crying, of people in pain. She'd hooked him up to machines that measured his physiological responses. "A typical brain," she explained, "when seeing someone in distress, will show a reaction. The heart rate might increase slightly. There's a spark of activity in the regions associated with empathy. It's a built-in alarm system that says, 'That person is hurting.' Lucas's brain shows no such reaction. The alarm system isn't broken. It was never installed." She talked about his intelligence. "He is very bright. He understands the rules of society on an intellectual level. He knows the script. He knows that stealing is against the rules and that hurting people is bad. But he doesn't feel the moral weight of those rules. To him, they are just data, like the rules of a board game." David leaned in. "So, when Lucas killed Tommy Wilkins, did he know it was wrong?" This was the moment. The entire courtroom leaned forward. "He knew it was a rule he was breaking," Dr. Evans said carefully. "Like a no running sign by a pool. He understood the consequence of being caught. But he did not, and he cannot, feel the inherent wrongness of it. There is no guilt, no remorse. There is only cause and effect." A stunned silence blanketed the room. This wasn't the story of a child overcome by rage or jealousy. This was the story of a child who had made a cold, logical calculation. Then, it was Mr. Albright's turn for cross-examination. He stood up, a sneer on his face, ready to dismantle the expert. "Dr. Evans," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "this condition. It sounds very convenient. It turns a cold-blooded murder into a what? A medical condition? A symptom." "It is an explanation, not an excuse," Dr. Evans replied, unflinching. "An explanation that lets him off the hook." Albright shot back. "No," she said, her voice sharpening. "It does not. It simply tells us what kind of hook we need. You cannot punish a child for feeling no remorse, any more than you can punish a blind man for not seeing. What you can do is recognize the profound danger he represents and manage it accordingly." Albright was furious. He was losing the jury. He marched up to the stand, getting in her face. "So, you're telling this court that Lucas Jenkins is a poor, sick little boy who just doesn't know any better? Is that it?" Dr. Evans didn't blink. She looked directly at him, and then slowly turned her head to make eye contact with every single member of the jury. Her voice dropped, but it was so clear and sharp it could have cut glass. No, Mr. Albright. That is not what I am saying. I am saying that Lucas Jenkins understands the difference between right and wrong in the same way a shark understands it is not supposed to bite you. It is a rule of its environment, not a moral imperative. He is not evil in the biblical sense. He is empty, a vacuum where a soul is supposed to be. And that, in many ways, is far more dangerous. The word hung in the air. Empty. It wasn't a diagnosis anymore. It was a verdict on his very humanity. And in that silent, horrified courtroom, it was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever heard. The word empty hung in the courtroom like a poison gas. What do you do with a child who is a void? What would you have done if you were on that jury? Pause for a second and comment your verdict below. The word empty followed Sarah home from the courtroom. It echoed in the silence of her rented apartment. It was in the steam from her tea, in the pattern of the lamplight on the wall. Empty. Dr. Evans had given a name to the chilling void she had seen in her son's eyes, but it didn't bring comfort. It only brought a deeper, more terrifying question. Why? Why was her son like this? She sat in the dark, the trial transcripts scattered around her, but she wasn't reading them. She was staring into the past. And for the first time in over a decade, she allowed herself to think about him. Lucas's father. His name was Daniel. She met him when she was young, a traveling salesman who blew into her life like a storm. He was charming, witty, with a smile that could light up a room. But his eyes... She had always pushed the memory away, but now, in her despair, it came rushing back. His eyes were the same pale blue as Lucas's. And sometimes, in a quiet moment, when the charm was switched off, they were cold, flat, like two stones at the bottom of a stream. Their relationship was a whirlwind. Intense, passionate, and over in less than a year. When she told him she was pregnant, his charming smile never faltered. He was supportive, he said. He'd be back in town soon, he promised. He kissed her goodbye, and she never saw him again. No phone call. No letter. He vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. She'd been hurt, of course. But mostly, she'd been relieved. A secret, shameful part of her had been relieved to be free of him. Now, she understood why. She got up, her movements slow and heavy, and went to the small closet where she kept a box of old memories. She dug past photo albums and yearbooks until her fingers brushed against a small, flat box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were a few trinkets from that time. A movie ticket stub, a dried flower, and a single photograph. It was of Daniel, his arm around her, that brilliant smile on his face. But she wasn't looking at the smile. She was looking at his eyes. She held the picture under the lamp, her heart thudding in her chest. She saw it now, with the clarity of hindsight and terror. The charm was a performance. Behind it was a profound, unsettling stillness. The same stillness she saw in Lucas when he was drawing his mazes, completely detached from the world around him. A fragmented memory, sharp as glass, cut through her. It was a few months after Daniel had left. She'd been watching the news, half asleep on the couch. A story came on about a series of assaults in a state too over. The suspect was described as charming, persuasive, and utterly remorseless. The police sketch flashed on the screen. It wasn't perfect, but the jawline, the eyes, it had looked familiar. So familiar it had made her sit up straight. But then, just as quickly, she dismissed it. It was just a coincidence. Her Daniel was a salesman, not a criminal. She had been so desperate to believe in the fairy tale that she'd ignored the monster lurking in the margins. Now, the pieces of the horrible puzzle slammed together. The charm that could be turned on and off like a switch. The cold, dead eyes behind the smile. The sudden, complete disappearance. The news report about the remorseless predator. It wasn't a random disorder. It wasn't a flaw in her parenting. It was an inheritance. A dark, poisoned seed passed from father to son. Lucas hadn't learned this emptiness from video games or from being bullied. He was born with it. He had inherited a brain that was wired without empathy, just like the man who had helped create him. The revelation wasn't a relief. It was a death sentence. It meant there was no fixing him. No therapy could install a conscience that was never there to begin with. This was his nature. This was his DNA. The next day, she met with David Chen in a frantic, hushed meeting. She spilled it all, the photograph, the news report, the chilling similarities. "It's his father's fault," she whispered, her voice raw. "It's in his blood." David listened, his face growing more and more grim. When she finished, he let out a long, weary sigh. "Sarah," he said softly, "it's too late. The trial is almost over. And even if it weren't, a jury can't hear that. It's pure prejudice. It would sound like you making excuses, blaming a ghost." He shook his head. "It doesn't change the facts of what Lucas did. It just explains them." And in that moment, Sarah understood the final, brutal layer of her tragedy. She had carried this secret, this shame, for years. And now, the one thing that could explain her son's condition, the one thing that could partially absolve her of the world's blame, was the one thing she could never say out loud in a court of law. The truth was her burden, and hers alone to carry. The foundation of her life wasn't just cracked. She had just discovered it was built on sand, and it was finally, completely giving way. This was it. The end of the line. After all the evidence, the experts, the tears, and the horrifying revelations, everything came down to this one last thing: the closing arguments. This was the final chance for both sides to grab the jury's heart and mind and pull them in their direction. The air in the courtroom was so thick with tension you could barely breathe. Mr. Albright went first. He was all sharp edges and cold, hard facts. He didn't need to shout. His quiet certainty was more powerful than any scream. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, standing right in front of them, blocking their view of Lucas. "This case is not about a misunderstood child. It is about justice for Tommy Wilkins, a little boy who trusted his friend, and who was betrayed in the most brutal way imaginable." He walked them back through it all. The rock. The fingerprints. The knot. The trash bags his own mother bought. "The defense would have you believe this is a sickness," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "They've brought in a doctor to use big words like callous and unemotional traits. I have a simpler word for it: evil. Monsters do not come with fangs and claws. They come in the form of an 11-year-old boy who can look his mother in the eye and lie without blinking, who can kill his friend and then sit in this very courtroom and draw pictures." He pointed a finger at Lucas. "Do not be fooled. Do not let this emptiness, be his get-out-of-jail-free card. The only way to protect society from a predator, no matter how young, is to lock it away. Find him guilty. Give Tommy's family the justice they deserve." He sat down. The silence was deafening. The jury looked shaken. They had seen the monster he was describing. Then it was David Chen's turn. He stood up slowly. He looked tired. He looked human. He didn't stand in front of the jury. He came around the table and stood beside it, making himself smaller, less threatening. "A predator," David repeated, his voice soft but clear. "A monster. Those are easy words. They let us put a problem in a box and seal it shut. But what if the problem can't be boxed? What if the monster is a sick little boy?" He didn't talk about the evidence. He talked about Lucas's brain. He called it a disability, not an excuse. "Imagine being born colorblind," he said, looking at each juror. "Everyone tells you the grass is green and the sky is blue, but you can't see it. You have to take their word for it. That is Lucas's life, but with emotions. He doesn't feel your green, he doesn't feel your blue. He has to mimic what he sees. Dr. Evans told you he is empty. She's right. But you don't punish someone for an empty cup. You try to find a way to fill it." His voice cracked with genuine emotion. "Sentencing him to a cage until he's 21 won't fill that cup. It will only harden the emptiness. He needs help. He needs treatment. He is a child. A broken, sick, dangerous child, but a child nonetheless. Your job isn't just to punish. It's to do what is right. And what is right is not to throw away a damaged life, but to try and salvage it. Find him guilty, yes. He committed this act. But then, I beg you, recommend he be sent to a facility that can treat him, not just a prison that will warehouse him. Don't just see the monster Mr. Albright showed you. See the patient. It was a beautiful, desperate, heartbreaking plea. Sarah felt a surge of wild, impossible hope. Maybe they had listened. Maybe they could see. And then, as David returned to his seat, Sarah made the mistake of looking at her son. Lucas had put his pencil down. He had listened to David's entire passionate, tear-streaked defense of his humanity. And on his face was the same mild, detached look of curiosity he'd had the whole time. He wasn't moved. He wasn't scared. He wasn't grateful. He was just waiting for the next thing to happen. In that moment, Sarah knew. David had been pleading for the life of a boy who didn't exist. He was fighting for a soul that wasn't there. And as the judge sent the jury away to decide her son's fate, Sarah felt the last flicker of hope die in her chest. They weren't waiting for a verdict on guilt or innocence. They were waiting for a verdict on whether a void could be saved. The wait was a form of torture all its own. After the fire and passion of the closing arguments, the courtroom emptied, leaving Sarah, David, and Lucas in a bubble of suffocating silence. They were moved to a small, windowless side room, a holding cell for the condemned or the acquitted. There was no way to know which they were. The first hour felt like a year. Sarah paced. 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. The cheap commercial carpet wore a path under her feet. She couldn't sit. She couldn't think. Her mind was just a frantic, looping prayer. Please, please, please. David Chen sat at a small table, staring at his hands. The brilliant lawyer was gone. Now he was just a man, waiting for a decision that would define his career and a boy's life. And Lucas? Lucas found a discarded sports section from a newspaper. He sat on a hard plastic chair and began working on the Sudoku puzzle in the corner, his pencil moving with calm, precise efficiency. The fate of his entire life was being decided by 12 strangers, and he was solving a numbers game. The sound of his pencil scratching the paper was the only noise in the room. The second hour. The third. Sarah stopped pacing. Her body gave out, and she slumped into a chair. The frantic prayer in her mind had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, gray ash of despair. She watched Lucas. She studied the top of his head, the way his hair fell over his forehead. He was her baby. Her little boy. How could this be happening? David's phone buzzed. A text. He read it, his face unreadable. "They've ordered dinner," he said, his voice hoarse. "It means they're in for the long haul. It could be tonight. It could be tomorrow." Sarah just nodded, unable to speak. The waiting was a physical weight on her chest, crushing the air from her lungs. And then, after 36 hours of this purgatory, it happened. A sharp, electronic buzz shattered the silence. It was the sound from the courtroom. The jury had reached a verdict. Sarah jolted as if she'd been electrocuted. Her heart didn't just beat, it tried to escape her chest. David stood up so fast his chair scraped back. "Okay," he breathed, more to himself than to her. "Okay. This is it." Lucas looked up from his completed Sudoku. He placed his pencil down neatly on the finished puzzle. He didn't look scared. He looked interested. Like the main event was finally about to start. Walking back into that courtroom was like walking to the gallows. The air was different now. Charged, electric. Every seat was filled. The reporters had their pens poised. Tommy's family held each other, their faces raw and pale. The jury filed in. They wouldn't look at Sarah. Not one of them. Her heart sank into her shoes. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge, an ancient, weathered man, took his seat. His voice was a low rumble. "Will the defendant please rise?" David gently nudged Lucas. The boy stood up, smoothing down his suit jacket. He was so small beside his lawyer. He looked up at the judge, his expression one of calm anticipation. Sarah tried to stand too, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She remained seated, frozen, her hands gripping the wooden bench in front of her like it was the edge of a cliff. The judge turned to the jury foreman, a woman with a stern, unreadable face. "Madam Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" The woman stood, holding a single piece of paper, a slip that held their future. "We have, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared her throat. The rustle of the paper was the loudest sound in the world. She looked down, and she read the first word. The world stopped. In the space between the foreman's breath and her first word, every sound, every thought, every heartbeat in the courtroom ceased to exist. Sarah's entire life narrowed to the woman's lips. Then, the word. Guilty. It wasn't loud. It was clean. Precise. A single sharp blade that sliced through the tension and cut Sarah's world in two. A single, unified gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was followed immediately by a raw, guttural cry of relief and anguish from Tommy Wilkins's family. His mother collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing. The sound was one of pure, unadulterated pain. Finally. Finally. Justice. Sarah didn't make a sound. The word guilty didn't feel like a verdict. It felt like a physical impact. It hit her in the chest and drove the air from her lungs. She slumped forward, her vision graying at the edges. This was it. They were taking her son away. Her boy. Her Lucas. All eyes swung to the defense table. To the 11-year-old boy who had just been found guilty of murder. David Chen put a steadying hand on Lucas's shoulder, his own face a mask of grim acceptance. He leaned down to whisper something, some word of comfort, some preparation for what came next. But Lucas wasn't listening. He processed the word. You could see it on his face. His brain received the data. Guilty. Negative outcome. The game is lost. He looked out at the scene before him. He saw Tommy's family wailing. He saw the reporters scribbling furiously. He saw the jury members, some of them crying, all of them radiating a thick, heavy solemnity. He saw the absolute peak of human drama, the zenith of emotion he had heard about but could never feel. And he found it funny. It started as a small, almost silent shake of his shoulders. Then a soft, breathy chuckle escaped his lips. It was a sound so utterly out of place, so alien in that room of grief, that at first people thought they were mistaken. But then it grew. It built into a clear, bright, genuine laugh. A child laugh of pure, unforced amusement. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It wasn't defiant. That would have required an understanding of the emotion he was supposed to be defying. This was simpler and far, far worse. It was the sound of someone who saw a tragic opera and thought it was a comedy. The laughter rang out, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. And in the face of that sound, the sound of a child laughing at his own murder conviction, the stunned silence of the courtroom shattered into a roar of pure, undiluted outrage. The sound of her son's laughter was the last brick. The final, crushing weight that broke her. In the chaos of the courtroom, the shouts of outrage, the judge's furious gavel pounding, the reporters scrambling for a better shot, Sarah's world didn't just fall apart. It inverted. The laugh was a key, turning in a lock deep inside her, and it opened a door to a truth so horrifying, her mind simply refused to hold it. Her head swam. The angry voices around her began to blur and warp, stretching into a distant, meaningless roar. Her vision tunneled, the edges going dark, until the only thing she could see with perfect, terrible clarity was her son, Lucas. His head was thrown back slightly, his shoulders still shaking with that innocent, amused sound. He looked like he was at a birthday party, watching a clown. Not in a courtroom, having just been condemned for taking a life. And in that single crystallized moment, she didn't see a monster. She didn't see a killer. She saw the tiny, quiet baby she had swaddled and rocked to sleep. She saw the toddler who'd clung to her leg on his first day of preschool. She saw the little boy she had read stories to, whose fevered forehead she had kissed, for whom she had worked herself to exhaustion, trying to build a good life. Every sacrifice, Every sleepless night, every moment of love and worry and desperate hope, it had all been poured into a bottomless well. The love was real. Her love. But it had been falling into a void all along, and she was only just now hearing the echo of its emptiness in his laughter. The foundation of her life, the very meaning of her existence as a mother, gave way. It wasn't just that her son had done something terrible. It was that her love had meant nothing. It had changed nothing. It had never, ever reached him. A wave of dizzying, soul-sick nausea washed over her. The roaring in her ears became a high-pitched whine. The image of her laughing son began to swim, the colors bleeding together. Her legs dissolved beneath her. There was no pain, no fear. Just a sudden, soft, and complete surrender to the nothingness. Her body went limp, sliding silently from the wooden bench. The last thing she was aware of was the cold, hard floor rising up to meet her, and the sound of her son's laughter, now muffled and distant, as if she were already sinking deep, deep underwater. The first thing Sarah was aware of was the smell. Antiseptic and stale flowers. It was the smell of a hospital. Her own workplace. The irony was a bitter pill in the back of her throat. She opened her eyes to the blurry white of a ceiling tile. Her body felt heavy, weighted down, as if she were still lying on that courtroom floor. A soft beeping from a monitor beside her bed marked the passing of seconds she wished would just stop. Sarah. The voice was familiar, weary. She turned her head, a stiff and painful movement. David Chen was sitting in a chair next to her bed. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the hours she'd been unconscious. "You fainted," he said softly, answering the question she hadn't asked. "The paramedics brought you here. You've been out for a while." He didn't say the other part. He didn't have to. The memory flooded back, not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, the sound of that laugh, the cold hard floor. She closed her eyes against the wave of shame. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice a dry croak. David's face tightened. "He's been remanded. He's in the juvenile detention center, awaiting sentencing. He's fine." He said the word with a kind of defeated finality. Of course he was fine. The one thing Lucas would always be was fine. Then David did something that seemed to cause him physical pain. He reached for a folded newspaper on the bedside table. He didn't hand it to her. He just held it up so she could see the front page. The headline was in massive, black, block letters, "The Laughing Killer." Below it was a photograph, perfectly captured, that would define them forever. It was Lucas mid-laugh, a look of pure, uncomplicated amusement on his face. And below that, a smaller, inset photo. Slumped on the courtroom floor, a bailiff rushing to her aid. The contrast was devastating. The monster and the mother who created him, both in one frame. Sarah turned her face away, toward the wall. She couldn't look anymore. A few hours later, a doctor discharged her. She was just dehydrated and in shock, he said. There was no medicine for what was really wrong with her. David walked her out, a hand under her elbow, as if she were an old woman. The doors of the hospital slid open, and the world attacked. A wall of sound and light hit her. Shouted questions. The blinding flash of cameras. A sea of furious, curious faces, held back by a line of security guards. Microphones were thrust toward her like weapons. "Sarah, how do you feel about the verdict? Did you know what your son was capable of? What's your message to Tommy's family?" She flinched, raising a hand to shield her eyes. This was her life now. She was no longer Sarah Jenkins, nurse. She was a public spectacle. A footnote in her son's horrific story. David bundled her into a waiting cab, shielding her with his body, and slammed the door. The driver, recognizing her, gave a low whistle and shook his head. She couldn't go home. The little rented apartment wasn't a sanctuary. It was just another place where the memories of her failure lived. She had David stop at a generic, boxy motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that rented rooms by the week and asked no questions. She paid in cash. The clerk at the front desk didn't look up from his phone. The room was exactly what she paid for. Beige walls, a dusty painting of a sailboat, the faint smell of cigarette smoke and bleach. She locked the door, slid the chain across, and leaned against it. The silence was absolute. And for the first time, she was truly, completely alone. No Lucas. No reporters. No David. No sympathetic looks or angry shouts. Just the hum of the cheap air conditioner and the weight of what had happened. She had lost everything. Her son. Her reputation. Her home. Her future. She was a ghost in a beige room, the mother of the laughing killer. And the sentence for that crime, she was beginning to understand, was a life term of silence. A month passed. A month of silence, of hiding, of existing in the beige motel room like a ghost. But a thread, however frayed, still tied her to Lucas. She was still his mother. The state said so. And a mother, the world insisted, should visit her son. So she went. The Northern Ohio Juvenile Detention Center was a low, concrete building surrounded by a double layer of razor wire. It didn't look like a place for children. It looked like a storage facility for broken things. Sarah went through the security check, metal detector, pat-down, signing her name in a logbook. Every procedure stripped away a little more of her humanity, until she felt as institutionalized as the building itself. She was led not to a room with tables and chairs, but to a long, narrow booth, divided by a thick pane of scarred, bulletproof glass. A black telephone handset was on her side. It felt less like a visit and more like an interrogation. Then a door on the other side opened, and a guard brought Lucas in. He looked smaller. His orange jumpsuit swallowed him, the color violently bright against the gray room. His hair was shorter, neater. He sat down in the chair opposite her, his movements calm and practiced. He looked at the telephone in front of him, then picked up his handset. She did the same, her hand trembling. "Hi, Lucas," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy through the line. "Hello, Mother." His voice was the same, flat, unchanged by concrete and wire. "They're treating you okay?" she asked, the inane question of every visiting parent. "It's efficient," he replied, looking around the booth. "The schedule is predictable." "I appreciate that." There was a long silence. Sarah's mind raced, searching for something, anything, to say. She couldn't talk about home. They didn't have one. She couldn't talk about the future. They didn't have one of those, either. "Your sentencing hearing is in 2 weeks, she finally said. "David thinks. He thinks it will be the maximum. Until you're 21. Lucas nodded. "That is the most likely outcome based on the statute." And that's when she knew she couldn't do this. She couldn't have this sterile, clinical conversation about the rest of his life as if they were discussing the weather. There was one question burning a hole in her soul. The one question that had echoed in the silence of her motel room every night since the verdict. She leaned forward, her forehead almost touching the cold glass, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Lucas," she said, "that day, in the courtroom, when they said you were guilty, why did you laugh?" He looked at her, his head tilting in that familiar, bird-like way. He wasn't surprised by the question. He seemed to have been expecting it. He took a moment, as if choosing the most accurate words. "It was the incongruity," he said, his tone as calm as if he were explaining a math problem. The verdict was a data point. A predictable one. But their reactions, the crying, the shouting, the man banging his wooden hammer, they were all so loud, so messy. They had the data. The outcome was logical. But they were behaving as if it were a surprise. As if it were a tragedy. He paused, his gaze steady on her through the glass. "I found the disconnect between the logical outcome and their illogical behavior amusing. It was like watching a flawed program glitch. It was funny." Sarah listened, and her heart didn't just break, it turned to dust. There was no darkness in his explanation. No malice. It was worse. It was pure, uncut reason, completely devoid of the music of human emotion. He hadn't been laughing at Tommy's family. He hadn't been laughing at the law. He had been laughing at a programming error in the human race. any last secret stubborn hope she had been clinging to, that somewhere, buried deep inside, he was a scared little boy, withered and died right there in that plastic chair. She looked at her son. She really looked at him. Not at the baby she remembered, not at the monster the newspapers described, but at the person he actually was. A beautiful, intelligent, empty vessel. She took a slow, deep breath. The trembling in her hands stopped. "Lucas," she said, her voice now clear and strangely calm. "I love you. I think a part of me always will, because I'm your mother. But the boy I loved, the one I thought you were, he doesn't exist. And I can't come back here to visit a stranger." He blinked. "Just once." "I understand," he said. There was no sadness in his voice. No anger. Just acceptance. More data. Sarah placed the telephone handset back into its cradle. The click was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She stood up, her legs steady for the first time in months. On the other side of the glass, Lucas watched her, his expression one of mild curiosity. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if closing a file. She turned and walked away, not looking back. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. She had just spoken her final words to her son. And in the echoing silence of that hallway, she knew she was now, and would be forever, completely and utterly alone. A year later, Sarah was still living in silence. She'd found a job at a small, walk-in clinic in a town 2 hours from Cleveland. No one knew her there. She was just the quiet woman who took blood pressure and updated charts. She lived in a small, plain apartment where the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. The peace she had once craved was now her prison. One Tuesday, the mail came. A single, official-looking envelope mixed in with the flyers and bills. The return address made her hands go cold, the Ohio Department of Youth Services. With numb fingers, she opened it. It was a notification, dry and bureaucratic. Lucas Jenkins, now 12, had undergone a mandatory review. The report stated he had shown no measurable progress in empathy-based therapies, and was deemed permanently incorrigible. His case was now flagged for automatic transfer to an adult maximum security prison upon his 18th birthday. There it was. The official stamp on her life sentence. Her son was a lost cause in the eyes of the state, a problem to be managed forever. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't scream. She felt nothing but a vast, cold quiet. She walked to the kitchen sink. She flicked on the lighter she used for the occasional candle, and she held the corner of the letter to the flame. It caught, curling black at the edges. She watched the words, "permanently incorrigible," vanish into ash before dropping the burning paper into the stainless steel basin. She turned on the tap, washing the ashes down the drain. The silence in the apartment was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the silence of a life that had shattered, and the endless, echoing quiet of the pieces that were left behind. This was the story of a verdict that solved nothing, and a laugh that condemned 2 people, one to a cell and the other to a lifetime of questions. If this story left you wondering where the line between tragedy and evil truly lies, subscribe for more. Next week, we delve into the mind of a forensic psychologist who has met dozens of Lucases, and what she says will haunt you even more.